Okay, let's talk about his philosophy, if he has one.
Yeah.
We've mentioned it before, but a great article in the Manchester Mill, which we can link to, about Burnham, and they were making the case that he doesn't really have much of a philosophy, and there's not really much to Burnhamism. A phrase that's been
Mm.
bandied around a lot recently is Manchesterism. I know you've got in front of you this paper, The Productive State Framework for Manchesterism.
Mm. So, yeah, I wanted to talk about this, and I'm going to use it actually just to talk a bit, once we've looked at what we think Manchesterism is, at the specific case of Thames Water, which I think is quite an interesting one in the news at the moment. This being our news item, we should talk about the news a little bit, shouldn't we? So yeah, what is Manchesterism? And I think there's a lot of vibes around it. And I think a lot of people who use the term haven't really thought much about what does it mean. But this paper, I think, is actually an interesting one and quite a compelling one. I don't necessarily agree with everything in it, but I think it's a very interesting read. And what they argue is that effectively the cost of living crisis, if we use that terminology, is really destabilising for everybody because it makes people very focused on just getting through their life. And they say it's very difficult politically because it also kind of undermines people's faith in the ability to vote for a political party that will then address their issues, because nobody seems to be able to do anything about anything. So they say, what do we do about that? What's the cause of that, and what do we do about it? And whilst they recognise that the cost of living crisis has lots of causes, like things like global instability and rising cost of oil, all those kind of things, they do point to the fact that a really big rationale and reason for it is the fact that the state no longer has control over essential services. Now, they tend to use words like control rather than ownership. So I don't think we're necessarily talking about old-fashioned nationalisation all the time. But they say that the fact that the state doesn't have control over essential services means that because that's been put out to private companies to run, there's lots of reasons why that makes it more expensive. I'll talk about that in a minute. But they say that what that does is it causes what they call a fiscal escalator, which I think is quite hard to say, actually. I have to concentrate on saying it. Fiscal escalator, which means that as the cost of living goes up, that has an automatic impact on the level of benefits, because lots of benefits are linked to inflation. But also things like the rising cost of housing has a direct impact on housing benefit. So those things push up state costs, which means that ordinary people effectively pay twice. They pay once for the fact that housing is more expensive and energy is more expensive, and then they pay again because the effect that those rising prices have on state expenditure means that taxation needs to go up. So they put that the argument in this Manchesterism thesis is that that's something that has to be addressed, that whole problem of private ownership of essential services. Now, a lot of people on the right would say, well, private ownership of essential services drives costs down because of competition, all those kinds of things. Why would they argue that it doesn't do that? So first of all, because actually in a lot of these areas, there's not really competition. So you might say you can shop around for your energy provider, but they're longish term contracts, aren't they? And not everybody can be bothered checking every 3 months what different providers' deals are. And, the state tries to create these kind of quasi-competitive processes within the provision of these services, but it's very cumbersome and clumsy, really. And if you look at things like tendering for the franchises on the rails, they're really long-term contracts, and the idea that there's day-to-day competition there, I think I don't think it's tenable, really, to argue that. So I think the argument that private sector works by lots of competition doesn't really work in a lot of these areas. And in fact, there's lots of reasons why it's actually more expensive to provide these services in the private sector. So if a private sector provider has to invest, they need to borrow money, and they'll always be charged more than government is charged for loans because there's a bigger default risk. So that makes things more expensive when it's provided in the private sector. There's also the fact that there's often a lack of vertical integration. So the obvious one is separating track and train. That, you know, if you separate those two, you need lots of interface and lots of management of that relationship, and that increased costs. And also, you know, if you look at privatisation, even on its own terms, as, you know, you get the state out of those things, actually the state is massively involved in all these areas, because when you've got a private sector organisation providing things, you have to have a lot of regulation, not just of that business, but of the way that they interact with other businesses. And often, you know, things crop up and then you have a bit more intervention and then you have another regulator, and you have regulators operating in overlapping ways in a certain area. So, you know, there's lots of government expenditure, even though it's meant to be privatised. And so for all those reasons, this thesis argues that we are paying way more for a lot of these essential services than we might do.
And they call it the privatisation premium.
That's right, yeah. And one of the numbers they have which will be relevant to the Thames Water discussion, is that 30% of your water bill covers the costs of debt in the water companies.
Debt that in some ways has been created whilst investors have been receiving dividends.
Partly that, but also partly just because debt costs more in the private sector because they have to pay higher charges. Scottish Water is perhaps a good example of how you compare it with. So Scottish Water is a private company, but it's wholly owned by the Scottish Government, so there's no private involvement. So its debt is really guaranteed by the Scottish Government, and their price includes about 10% to cover debt costs. So you can see that, you know, arguably we're paying 20% too much for water because it's privately owned.
And when Scottish Water borrows money, are they borrowing at a rate that the Scottish Government would be able to borrow?
Slight additional premium, but very small.
Okay.
Not the kind of...
and is that because Scottish Water could go bust and be liquidated?
Well, if Scottish Water did go bust, it would effectively... It's the Scottish Government are the only equity holders. So effectively they would have to bail it out. They'd like to argue that they're not required to do that, but I think in reality it would be very difficult for them not to. It's very different in the private sector, and perhaps we'll come on to that when we talk about Thames Water rather than getting distracted by that.
Can I ask about that then? So
yeah.
the paper, firstly, who wrote it? And secondly, what has that got to do with Manchesterism? And why? Because I'm sitting here thinking, okay, we're in Manchester right now. What is Manchesterism? Is it bright and shiny new skyscrapers ruining the culture of the city? Yeah,
okay. So who's it written by? It's written by an organisation within the Labour Party called Mainstream. So the guys who wrote it called Matthew Lawrence, Alex Williams. I think they both work for a think tank called Commonwealth, 2 words, Commonwealth. But Andy Burnham has used this term, the productive state, quite a lot. So I do think he has been guided by it. Now, you ask, you know, what's got to do with Manchesterism? So this argument that you need the state to control more, this is very obvious what I'm going to say now, but a good example of that is the B network in Manchester. This is the public, it's not publicly owned. This is the transport system that is now publicly controlled. So effectively the Mayor's office now control on all our buses, fares, timetables, all those kind of things, although those buses are still owned privately. Now, the two things we've not talked about in terms of what this Manchesterism analysis does are, first of all, whilst they say we need more state control, they do kind of apply tests to where that state control should be applied and where it shouldn't, because they're very keen to say they don't want the state to crowd out the market. And the other thing they say is that there's different ways in which the state could intervene. So one of the ways they could intervene, for example, is by being a purchaser and seller of goods. So, you buy, the state intervenes to kind of level out volatility in prices. One of the examples they use is there used to be a gas storage facility, which has disappeared now. And, if the government were to require or to control the requirement for some gas storage facility, that would mean it could, effectively intervene to level out prices. So it doesn't necessarily mean you own it. And so I think where you would argue this is Manchesterism is by saying in Manchester and the transport, the government, the mayor's office has not intervened to buy stuff back or to renationalise, but it has intervened to have more state control. And that, I think, is what they would argue is one of the tenets of Manchesterism. Can I say a bit about the test I think they should apply to say whether or not it's a good area for state control? So the tests they have are, first of all, a test of whether there's kind of what they call productivity exhaustion. So if you think about areas where the market works well, it tends to work well where it can improve productivity by innovation, for example, by introducing new technology, new processes. And, that's how competition works, because if you do that, then you can do things more cheaply than somebody else in the market. But there's lots of areas where actually the only way that a provider can drive down prices is by reducing pay or reducing quality. And perhaps the best example of that is care. So you can't really have a lot of productivity gains within the care sector because it's all about, looking after people. And so, if it's one of those areas, that's potentially one where it would be appropriate for there to be some state intervention. That's one example. Other examples they have are, for example, if it's an area where a change in the cost of something ripples through the whole of the economy. So I'd say energy is a good example of that, where if energy costs go up, it affects not just you or not just company A, but everybody within society. And it kind of becomes a systemic risk for society if the costs of that escalate. They also have a couple of perhaps wider political tests. One is, for example, where it's something where it's a kind of social good that, you're trying to provide. So housing perhaps might be something that falls into that as an example. And something where it's a kind of policy area. And to me, the best example of that is defence, where, you're just not going to get you're not going to get a private sector ability to run our defence spending for us. The other one that perhaps I haven't mentioned is just one where it's very difficult for the private sector to think long term. And, we talked a bit about that earlier, that, if you've got to invest long term, that's something it's harder for the private sector to do. Very much focused on quarterly earnings and profit levels, and trying to prioritise, where you're going to be in 5 years is more difficult for the private sector. So, they do say that there should be tests where state intervention is sensible or not. And they also lay out different ways in which the state might intervene. So the idea of, mentioned already, whether you can level out volatility in prices, that's one. Another is where they say the state could act as a decommodifier. These are some of these terms you kind of think, well, what does that mean? So, for example, they say it's perfectly possible for us to address through general taxation the cost of an initial essential level of energy. So effectively, the energy providers, perhaps they're privately owned energy providers, would provide everybody with the kind of basic level of energy without anybody paying anything. That's effectively paid for through general taxation. And then you pay for what you want on top of that. So they say that might be an area where the state could intervene. And And then, they also say there's an area where the state could intervene by directly producing. And an example of that would be if the state started to rebuild council houses and actually be the provider of those services. So different ways in which the state could intervene. So I think the kind of overarching theory, if we're trying to say what is Manchesterism, it's saying that there are sensible ways where the state can intervene, perhaps not by direct ownership, but by thinking about how do we provide essential services at affordable costs in a way that addresses the cost of living crisis.
It just seems to me that these things are have not really happened in Manchester. I mean, you've got the B network as a publicly controlled transport network. Do you think they've just attached the label Manchesterism to get the attention of Andy Burnham? Was like a toy for a cat. They've sort of dangled it in front of him. Like, look, it's Manchester.
Well, is it not branding? I'd say that's what it is. It's branding, really, isn't it? It's saying, because I don't think these suggestions are necessarily new. They're trying to codify them under giving it one label. But I'd say it's more branding than anything else. And obviously the fact that as soon as you think of Manchester, you're thinking of Andy Burnham at the moment. The fact that those two fit together, I think, is quite nice for them, in terms of how they're trying to sell both Andy Burnham and these political ideas. I think it's quite nice for them to fit together. But yeah, I think it is. There's definitely a lot of vibes, even though there is, I would argue, some level of analysis behind it.